So today I'm going to interview Kevin Crawford and Bernadette Sweeney about this lovely book that they both wrote, and it's called Roy Hart. It is a very nice book, uh, 160 pages, with beautiful photos from Ivan Mitrich, our dear colleague and friend, and also some of them by Bernadette. Um, the label is the Routledge label, Performance and Patrician, and which also I've done for the Margaret Pikes that I also interviewed about a nice book. So hello, Kevin. Welcome.
Hi, good to see you.
Me too. Um, so I'm going to introduce you, and just for the people who don't know, Kevin. And Kevin is a founding member of the Roy Art Theatre Company. He toured extensively with the company for over 20 years before moving to Ireland in 1993, where he was a member of faculty at the School of Drama at Trinity College. In Ireland, he collaborated with a large number of theatre, dance, and musical groups, as well as regularly contributing to programs at University College Dublin and University College Cork. He has been a guest facilitator at Abbey, National Theatre of Ireland, the International Workshop Festival in London, the Lear, National Academy of Dramatic Arts, Ireland, and CIRRA, Strasbourg. In 2001, he was awarded an MA in Voice Studies from the Royal Centre School of Speech and Drama. On his return to France in 2002, Kevin was appointed lecturer at the Université d'Artois before joining the Accademia dell'Arte in Arezzo, Italy, as a founding member of faculty. From 2006 to 2016, he directed the MFA in Physical Theatre at the Accademia. Directorial credits included Wolf's Bride for Kuopio City Theatre, Finland, the Bacchae and Oedipus for the Samuel Beckett Centre, Dublin, and Bartholomew Fair for the Baker Theatre, Muhlenberg College, United States. He wrote recently performed Monty, collaboration with Caroline Boersma, cellist, with performance in the USA, Italy, and France. Well, 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 Kevin. What a life. You've done a lot, huh? Well, looking back to this, if we could put these things like backward perspective to your life, which is rich, a very rich life, I believe so. Um, how do you feel at this point of your life?
Well, I'm very aware now that, of the stage, the moment I am in my life. So, I'm not at the beginning, I'm not in
Yeah.
the middle, I'm I'm reaching the fallen leaf stage,
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's to do with, I think, for me, how I can um, encounter this part of my life in a serene and yeah, uh, fulfilled way. Yeah, not feel like, oh gosh, I didn't do this and I didn't do that, but
Yeah.
rather simply, yes, I've done those things. Those things perhaps I didn't do, but now is the time to also, let go, but I can still contribute, but it has to be in a different way.
Hmm. Hmm. Good. Maybe this book is a reflection of it, no? Somehow.
Absolutely, because I mean, writing the book enabled me to, if you like, particularly that particular journey through the 8 years that the book follows, basically,
Hmm.
enabled me to follow that journey in particular and remember it, yes, and rediscover it in some ways through doing the research that Bernadette and I did together. And the
Hmm.
fact of doing the research with her was very valuable because she was fresh to it, she hadn't personally lived it, so she's able to give a perspective on it that I wouldn't necessarily have had. And she
Hmm.
was also able to pull out, to tease out strands in that story that, again, I might not have done if I'd only written by myself. So I think it was a very good collaboration in that sense that she was able to be a good kind of counterweight to my more immediate experience.
Directly, what is this book about?
I think the book is about Roy Hart in particular. It's also about the company that formed around him, but in some sense, and he even says it, and it's even in one or two of the kind of quotes from the plays, in some way the company was a reflection of him and he was a reflection of the company. So there was a kind of, you could say, bonding on that level that was very strong. So I feel the book is about him in particular and his particular influence on both those very close to him, but also now on a wider, if you like, field of work on the voice. The only way that we can, in a sense, have some taste of what he offered is only through the testimonies of those that he actually immediately worked with. With time, also, I think there is some perspective now, on what it was that he was offering, and how that particular period in time that he was offering it was also reflected in the kinds of shows, the kinds of social interactions that went on within that company.
One of the things that I found interesting in the book was about the reference and the importance that you open about Dorothy Hart. That I was not so aware of that, because I've never met Roy, of course, and so I have only the legacy of the work, and I meet all of you founding members. But I wasn't so aware of that, and I was very interested and curious about it. With what you wrote, not only about what you write, but you give also some. In the book is very rich of that, full of letters, cards, and it's also your perspective, but you integrate your perspective with kind of testimonies also, which is very interesting, the way it flows along the book, this reference and your perspective and this balance between both things. Can you tell us a little bit about Dorothy?
Yeah, I think that our, if you like, giving space, giving body to Dorothy's presence and also others was very important in the book because they, in a sense, were his mouthpiece. They were able to write down, particularly Dorothy, what his philosophy was and how it represented or how it was manifested in his shows. So he was a kind of, in some ways, you could say, a central patriarchal figure. But in fact, the women around him were extremely important, and he couldn't have done what he did without them. That's just the fact. And Linda, and both Linda and Paul point this out. And I think, in writing the book, I very much wanted the voices of the others to be heard. We read Dorothy's program notes, which are very extensive sometimes. We realize, how, what a thinker she was and how she was able to articulate what Hart was doing and how valuable that is in hindsight, because without her writings, we would be poorer in terms of understanding what was behind the Bacchae or what was behind l'Economies. The ideas that Hart had, she could actually do. And it was very special to be able to be with someone like that.
At least what I can get from the book and from your testimony, I'm sorry, that gives this, at least for me, that as a reader, as a balance between this Roy Hart point of view of life and integration of the company, but also Dorothy vision and maybe integration of Roy vision or work or ideology for life and for the company. No, correct me if
I think so. And I mean, Dorothy was a very unusual woman. She she didn't follow traditional paths. She was quite unconventional. She'd met a man in Tanzania who was a chief that she'd fallen in love with. and they had a child, Jonathan, and they decided to separate. He stayed in his home country, and he became a very important chief, and he was instrumental in the decolonization of the country. And Dorothy then began her life in England with a young child, from this union. And Roy Hart, took on Dorothy and her child, her son. And so I do think, she was an important, as you say, counterweight or balancing factor. Vivian was as well, but later. Dorothy had basically been with Roy Hart, not from his beginning with Wolfsohn, but from the time when he began to, in a sense, make his own way and make his own way of doing things. She was his partner through all that process, a kind of 10-year process from the late 50s to the early 70s.
Now that you refer to Alfred Wolfsohn, your book covers, since the beginning, from Alfred Wolfsohn ideas until the Roy Hart Theatre Company. And it's also interesting the way you document this history, if you can look like that, because it's what it is also. And so I feel like your book is not only kind of for Roy Hart students, if you can, or for people who are involved in the Roy Hart work. Other people can read this book and be more aware, reading the book of what it is and what it was.
Yeah, these books, this particular series called the Routledge Performance Practitioners, is basically 20th century practitioners who've had big influence. So it's going to be people like Peter Brook, Mnouchkin, Grotowski, Lecoq, and they are these small books. They're not big books, and they're designed in a sense as a kind of almost an entry-level book to give an introduction to an important person. And this book, by the way, on Roy Hart, is the first book about a so-called voice practitioner. Most of the other books about either directors or movement work. The aim is that, students at undergraduate level or whatever can have a book that, will or make an, introduction. And if they want to go further, then they can read other books or they can, make other research. But you're right. I think we had to make a book that was, as much as possible intelligible to a more general public, and not only to an initiated public. But we were helped in that as well, because both Bernadette is also an assistant editor for the Routledge collection. Okay. So she has that in mind, and we are very helped by the main editor, by Frank Chamberlain, who was very precise. So we had to have those little boxes just to give the background that was necessary to be able to understand the thrust of the story.
We spoke about Dorothy and Paul and Vivienne. Yeah, about Paul, that recently have left us. How was his relation with Roy, or maybe some influence? I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit?
Paul was very friendly to me. So Paul was 12 years older than me. So when I first came to what was called the studio, I would go back on the bus with him and his wife Nadine every day. And I did actually live with them for 3 months or so. They very kindly received me. So he was like a kind of big brother. And I think that because Paul was a professional actor, so he was coming from a professional theatre world, and he met this man and realized that this is what he wanted and needed to do. So that meant he had to also revise a lot of things about what acting meant for him. I think he was close to Roy. He was part of the closer circle. Yeah. So around Roy Hart, there was a circle of closer people. It did move, though. The circle wasn't a fixed thing. So you might move in and out of the circle. And he was one of the ones who was closer, also one of the ones who'd spent longer with him. And because of his closeness then with Dorothy as well, Paul became very much a kind of part of Roy Hart's intimate circle, you could say.
In your book, you also make reference to the performance like by Kai and by a drum and L'Economist. And reading after reading this, I asked myself, what I want to ask you, what was there was something in common in these performances, like they were all directed by Roy, some not. How was the organic of how do you arrange to perform?
Well, I think the Bacchae was very much an expression of his work up to and including 1969. Yeah, because he'd worked for a long time. He had a very solid core group, and he now also had a number of younger members as well, because there were like two generations. The generation of Hart, who at that point was 40, roughly, 42, 43, and the generation of, well, kind of, I was a younger one of my generation, but they were in their mid-20s, something like that. So the Bacchae really was, I think, a kind of summation of what he'd done up to that point. No two of the performances were ever the same, which was also a principle that he upheld very strongly. Accidents would always happen. Things would be put in there that weren't there the previous night. And he would, in a sense, direct from the stage, or in some cases from the piano, because there was even a piano on stage and so on. So it was very much a kind of, to some degree, improvised, although there was a huge, you could say, also discipline behind it. Everyone knew every single word of the text and could even recite it backwards in gibberish. I mean, crazy things. Dorothy Hart, for instance, and I think I spoke about it with Bernadette in the book, plays the role of the dreamer, the one who comments on what's going on, a very special role. I mean, but then after that, Roy Hart went more for him towards performance, musical theatre performance. He left the company to work a bit more by itself. And in fact, the performance called And was directed by four company directors. And Hart was more a kind of, I don't know, deus ex machina, who was there just sometimes to make sure that people didn't kill each other, But he gave the company the possibility of forming their own versions of things. And a lot of the things that came up, let's say in a performance by And, at that point, were versions of exercises that had been going on for years. And they were then just given more form, they were given choreography, plasticity, musicality, and then put together. Basically, it was a collage. Be a Drum was a solo of Roy Hart's, and again, he used that like a visiting card. It was tailored for him, written by Serge Béard, and gave him the opportunity to show what incredible gifts he had in handling words and being a solo artist. The final show the book tells about, L'Economiste, although there were several other shows in between, which again the company looked after much more, was overseen by Roy Hart. But because he was the main character in it, he couldn't direct all the things. So a lot of the actual individual scenes, all the dances, all the music were coming from members of the company. He was not writing the music. He was not choreographing the dances. They were choreographed on him and on others. So there was a terrific input from the other members of the company. Yeah, so each of those four shows was actually quite different in its composition and in its conception in a way. But let's say L'Economiste still had within it the choral elements, the extreme vocal elements, the ensemble work, and but what the difference was that Hart had overseen the text, and the text had a strong, you could say, philosophical content. He wished it to have a strong philosophical content so that his vision and his philosophy was also in some way mirrored through the story and through the words of the story. That's the difference with something like the Bacchae. The words were not a vehicle for his philosophy. The vehicle was the sounds and the plasticity and the kind of extraordinary vocal journey that it took.
And what about you in the performing with the company?
Well, I mean, it was very, performing these shows was very strong. Obviously, I didn't perform in Beardrum, but I performed in the other three. Yeah, I mean, it was just a very, very strong experiences.
Yeah,
No two shows were the same. L'Economiste was perhaps had some extraordinary moments. At the beginning of the show, Jonathan Hart, Roy Hart's adopted son, Dorothy's son, plays a long solo on the piano, singing a kind of a version of rolls from the Magic Flute in a very unusual and symbiotic way. And it's just an extraordinary moment. So you're waiting in the wings and you've got this going on.
Yeah.
The end of the show was very kind of had a lot of pathos in it, because the company is basically circling, making a big circle. It was a big company in the show. It was like 23 or so actors. And they're just saying jour après jour après jour, day after day after day, meaning that life is like that, every day is a new day, and every day you've got to keep going in the circle, and every day you've got to remake it and give birth to it. And of course, we had to do that play then after the deaths of Roy Hart and Dorothy Hart and Vivian Hart, and the injuries that Paul Silver also experienced. And of course, coming to that at the end of the play, sometimes it was had a lot of feeling in it.
At some point, you make also reference because you were saying about Roy, like Peter Maxwell Davies, Karl Stockhausen, and Hans also collaborate or compose to Roy Hart, no?
Yeah, I mean, all three of them were kind of blown over by tapes that he showed them, or by demonstrations that he gave of his voice and what he could do. Mm-hmm. And so they all three very spontaneously said, I'm going to write to you, write for your voice with something. I have something in mind. Less because he used, I think, elements that he already had. But Maxwell Davies and Hans Werner Henze also did write two pieces that, used his vocal abilities within them. In Maxwell Davies' case, there was, a period of improvisation on Hart's behalf with the texts that Maxwell Davies gave him, which were by Randolph Stowe, and Hart would send these improvisation tapes back to Maxwell Davies, but which I think, served as inspiration for him, but it was Maxwell Davies's composition. But it gave a terrific scope for Hart's voice, and it was a very theatrical piece with the performers in bird cages and things like that. Yeah. It was a really, pretty stunning piece of music theatre. Hans Werner Henze was more like an oratorio feeling, with the musicians in a more kind of conventional stage framework, and Hart as the only person who was really moving as a soloist.
But if you look to the future, what you can imagine about the Roy Hart work? What is your concept or your idea? What will be in the future?
Gerard, that's a difficult question.
I know.
Very difficult. First of all, now this book that Bernadette and I wrote, we had very clear, what you call cahier des charges, a very clear sequence that we had to follow. So the first chapter, biography; second chapter, writings; third chapter, key performances; and fourth chapter, some kinds of exercises. So, and we had to follow that, and the lengths of the chapters. So I did feel, that I wanted it to be just not me, and I was delighted that four, members of the Roy Hart Centre
Yeah.
of different generations as well were happy to contribute to it. I do feel that writing some of these exercises down is very difficult, and not unless you have first-hand experience, it's really hard.
It is.
To take them off the paper and do them, I'm not convinced.
Yeah.
But still, we did it because we had to do it. But hopefully they can be useful in some way, or at least evoke some kinds of ideas in the listener or the reader. Now, in terms of the future, I think it's a great question, and it's a difficult one, because I'm also always asking myself, what is it that we can say, oh yes, this is the work in the line of Wolfsohn and Roy Hart? Can I watch a lesson given by a colleague of mine and say, yeah, that's in the line there, or that isn't, or where does that come from? But then when I look at myself, I have to be honest and say, a lot of what I do also doesn't only come from the Roy Hart Wolfsohn line. It comes from the others in the Roy Hart company that I worked with. It comes from people I worked with outside. It comes from books that I've read. It comes from a lot of different sources. It comes from me trying things out by myself, and it comes from serendipitous or spontaneous moments in class. So I would be hard put. I've tried to write down what might be common themes between the Roy Hart teachers, but it's not easy because there's no there's no method in the sense that Hart and Wolfsohn did not leave any written or even verbal methodological signs. There is a wide range of teachers who teach in the name of the Roy Hart tradition. Some of them bring fantastic musical skills, others movement skills, others theatre skills, others are very subtly able to handle personal themes, personal development. So it would be hard to say there's only one pathway. Humanity, listening, hearing, I do think those are key elements of the Roy Hart teaching. And that kind of hearing, which is it's beyond hearing. It's a listening beyond listening. It's a kind of tuning in a certain way, both to your own soul and the heart and soul of the person you're with, and not taking anything for granted, or not having a specific outcome that you have to achieve with the person that you're listening to.
I interview Kevin about the book, his intentions, the content of the book. We spoke a little bit about you, but not much. And so that's why also we want to include you on the interview, also because of what you have done also, and to recognize your work. And thank you for what you've done through also with Kevin and about the Roy Hart work. So maybe I will start from the beginning. How did you meet?
Oh, it's a long time ago now, Kevin. I was a PhD student in Trinity College in Dublin, and Kevin was giving voice classes in the evenings, and those were open. They weren't set in the curriculum. He also taught in the actors curriculum. So I joined those, and that's when I first met. So I first encountered Kevin as a teacher. I was working with a theatre company in Dublin, and we hosted Pan Theatre. So Pan Theatre came to Dublin. It was a combination workshop, actually. It was Pan Theatre and Kristen Linklater. And we ran that one summer, and I met Pan Theatre, and that's when I started to put the Roy Hart picture together. And that's when I realized I already had a connection because of my classes with Kevin. I was extraordinarily lucky because Andy Crook, who's a movement specialist and trained with Lecoq, would switch out with Kevin. So I was either working with Andy in that room or with Kevin. And so that allowed me to stay connected to practice in a really actually meaningful way, and shaped an awful lot of that kind of physical engagement with the work, helped to keep my mindset connected to a history that I felt needed to be considered from the perspective of the embodiment of the actor.
Mm-hmm.
Then I encountered Kevin. I was stuck. I was stuck in my research, and I encountered Kevin one day on campus, and he encouraged me to consider going to Malerargues and training with Pan Theatre there because they were offering a summer workshop. So I went and spent a number of weeks at Malerargues training with Enrique and Linda and Lisa. And that was my first introduction to Malerargues, and that's when I got a fuller sense of the Roy Hart history. And being there really actually was quite profound in a way, because you can feel the history of the whole company in that place. And I was encountering it in kind of disparate ways in different practices, from very related, of course, from Kevin and from Pan Theatre. But once I got to Malerargues, that's when it all started to come together. And I had the opportunity to do other workshops while I was there with other original members of Roy Hart who were still giving workshops there at that time. And it actually really helped with my own research as well.
And how was it, Kevin? You invite Bernadette to the book, or was Bernadette to tell, well, you should write a book, or how was this?
I actually was thinking about that earlier today, and I was trying to think, well, how did that book idea first happen? And, I don't really remember that it was one or other of us that said, we must do this, or it just seemed to somehow kind of emerge somehow. Mm-hmm. Bernadette, do you agree that it was like that?
Well, Frank Chamberlain and I edit the series, the Routledge Performance Practitioner series. It was Frank Chamberlain who started it, and he was the editor for a long time. And then a few years ago, Routledge wanted to expand the series. And so they asked him if he was interested in bringing somebody in. And we had worked together for a long time at University College Cork, although neither of us were there anymore at that point. And so he asked me if I would come on board as a co-editor, and we would edit the series together. And we were thinking of what's missing. And of course, there are so many things that are missing in that series, and we're constantly trying to find the gaps and consider and ask who would be willing to participate. And I think it was a conversation with Frank and I as we looked at where we wanted the series to go next that precipitated that. And then that's when Kevin and I started communicating about the possibility of a Roy Hart book.
I did felt excitement, at the idea of writing, but with Bernadette, because the fact is that Bernadette brought something that I didn't have. I brought something that she couldn't have. And that, I think, made it a more fruitful collaboration, and also, opened up, if you like, in different ways, the way of, I suppose, looking at the history.
How was that for you to be helped by another person, in this case Bernadette, to, like, you are a double thing, because you research about the work that also you have done?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there's a strength, or there's a power in being, having a first-hand experience, but there's also the difficulty sometimes in having the distance from it to be able to look at it in context, not only of that company, but also of its time in history. And I think that Bernadette was very able to do that, and also to bring out things that probably I wouldn't have done by myself. Particularly, I feel, Dorothy Hart and other members who contributed an awful lot, and in a sense made Roy Hart tangible or visible, readable, you could say.
So the Routledge Performance Practitioner series is a bigger project, as I'm sure you know, and this is now the Roy Hart edition as part of that project. And they have a set structure, as Kevin says. There's a lot of flexibility within the structure, and there's quite a difference from one edition to the next. But basically, it's a 4-chapter structure or 4-section structure, where the first looks at the biography of the artist or the company, and the second chapter looks at writings and theories. The third looks at productions, if there's a production history. And the last chapter looks at rehearsal and studio technique. So that's where the actual exercises live, in that last chapter. And interestingly, Routledge has now published 2 kind of spin-offs of the series, but prior to when we wrote this edition. So Roy Hart isn't part of these projects, but they've kind of put together, or had Kevin and Frank and I edit together a series of chapters from this from the works into the Routledge Companion to Performance Practitioners. That's the big kind of volume, 2 volumes actually, of the first 2 chapters. And they also had us edit the Routledge Handbook to Studio Performance Practice, and that's all the chapter 4s from the series up to, what was it? La Page, I think, is the last one. So they're these kind of ancillary volumes that have come from the series and spin-off projects. And as I said, Kevin has more than enough material now, and his own personal testimony, as you say, to do more with the research. He certainly is in a great position to do that. This was never going to be a full personal history because, as Kevin says, the nature of the series is kind of set. And it's intended to frame the practice, that rehearsal and studio technique chapter. It's intended to frame that for the reader, but also it's intended to be read by people who will want to practice. So it gives context for the work that they will then be doing.
Also, there are not only exercises from Kevin, the Pascal's suggestions, or even Edda or others in there. And there are some photos that are taken from you, Bernadette, no? You took the photos.
Yes, so I did some of that work with my graduates class, and one of my graduate students is the actor in those pictures. Yeah, mm-hmm. Amy Paxton.
Mm-hmm. At this point, I don't know if you'd like to add something about this level of research in doing the book, or we go to the final item, like what it was to finish the book, looking back. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, what might be interesting would be to hear from Bernadette a little bit about what it is that she felt that she particularly wanted to bring out in the book, you know, that perhaps I wouldn't have done, that she found that was really important. So that would be good to hear from her a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Kevin alluded to this earlier. You know, going through the histories and, you know, my own experience as a researcher in theatre practice and in Irish theatre practice, I was very interested in trying to give a fuller picture of the contributions of the company members. And I think that was partly, perhaps, maybe even indirectly influenced by the fact that I never met Roy Hart. And so his legacy is very powerful and profound. But I've only ever received it through the teachers that he left behind and the practitioners that he left behind. In conversations with Kevin, and then also going through the archives at Malerargues, which we did together, which was such an extraordinary opportunity to have. I was very struck by the writings and contributions of Dorothy Hart. And I felt it was really important to try to give some sense of the sheer scale of her contribution as well. As a playwright, as a producer, as a financial backer, as on so many practical levels as a fundraiser. She was, you know, a Renaissance woman of the theatre, and her contribution is really only being more fully acknowledged in recent years. She's even been credited now as the co-writer or the co-playwright of one of the plays that for, you know, 60 years or more was solely credited to Yeats. And so that being part of my research, you know, I did kind of go in with that example or that experience in my head. And I just wanted to make sure that the contributions of some of the notable women in the company was also recognized. I know I couldn't contribute from the experience of having worked with Roy Hart. That's not something that I had the opportunity to do. But what I brought, I guess, to the table was some experience of going through the traces of what's left behind. And that I felt was very important to acknowledge the legacy of Dorothy Hart.
The writings of Dorothy Hart that have been available, particularly the writings about the Economiste, were English translations of a French translation of her original writing in English. So we were looking at a kind of third-hand version, whereas we did actually find, by whatever we found it, the original handwritten version of her writings, for instance, for L'Economiste. And when you see that written out in her hand and then typed by her afterwards with all the corrections and all the changes that she made, you go, oh my God, you know, that it hits you then in a very powerful way. So we are able to be in contact with her actual initial writing. And I think it just became clear that this was someone who actually was his voice in some way. She was also her own voice. She was very, and Linda, by the way, Linda Wise Pardo has also made very clear that she was very much her own voice, but she did also voice Roy Hart. Writing the book, though, gave me and us the opportunity to look at 4 of the shows in a very specific and focused way. And that I wouldn't have done off my own bat if I hadn't had to. I also wrote far too much about all that, which we managed to obviously take it all out. But the fact was that we did look at those 4 shows in a way that I know that for those who were in it as well, has sparked off memories. Oh gosh, I've forgotten all about that. Oh my gosh, this is what I remember now. This is what happened, you know? And that has been a good thing, I think, that we were able to really go into those 4 shows and bring out, the particular, if you like, genius or particular color of each of those shows.
I mean, I'm sitting here talking about Dorothy Hart. I never met Dorothy Hart. And, you know, all of these people Kevin has had, you know, a profound artistic relationship with over a very long period of time. And one of my real ambitions with the project was to honor that legacy, Kevin's legacy, and the legacy of the Pan Theatre members and all of the Roy Hart members, because so much of that does get forgotten. That embodied experience of the actor gets forgotten. And then, you know, as Kevin says, we go through and we find handwritten notes, or we find draft scripts, and it prompts the most extraordinary deluge of memory and image, and you know, it's these kind of almost dry details shake loose the art and shake loose the art history of the work and of the practice. I will say too that when we were in Malerargues that time, going through the archives a number of years ago, Kevin was teaching a summer workshop that I recorded sections of. And again, it's always that connection to practice. That's where the work lives. And that's why, you know, I think theatre scholarship and practice as research is so important. Practice as research is so important in our discipline, because, you know, watching and documenting that teaching in practice.
You spoke about the importance of this embodiment of the work. And in the interview before you that I've done with Kevin, at some point I asked him how he could see the future of the work, of Roy Hart work. And at some point he said, like, well, I really don't know how can I see it, or my vision of the work through the other generations. And maybe I will ask you the same, Bernadette. How it is your vision, as a curiosity for myself, how it is your vision about Roy Hart work in the future?
Well, I mean, obviously, hopefully we've contributed, and so have, the materials generated by Noah Bikes and by Margaret and others who published in the field. I think for me, though, it really is that tradition of teaching and performance practice. So Kevin's workshops, such a global phenomenon now, the workshops of those who have Roy Hart training. We see it in different countries. We see it, different people from many different places coming back to Malerargues to train. I wonder if it's comparable perhaps to what we see happening with the Chekhov tradition, Michael Chekhov tradition, and how there are different kinds of trainings offered and even certifications offered. And I think that's actually a really interesting question in, the bigger question of theatre practice and theatre training, because, then the question becomes, and Kevin and I have had these conversations, who are the gatekeepers? How is the training transmitted? Who gets to say that they have a level of authority when it comes to transmitting this tradition, but also think about how it came about, because of course so much of it is influenced by Wolfsohn, for example, and so much of it lives on in the practices, of Roy Hart himself, but also, as we've said, in the other company members. And some materials were developed in collaboration, for example. We document that to some extent in the book. And so when it comes to this question of what happens to it in the future, like I said, I think the Michael Chekhov model is an interesting one. It might be the one that's comparable.
There is more clarity now in some ways on the certification or process of being recognized. It has a kind of, it has a protocol. Which is pretty loose, and yet it has certain kind of obligatory elements in it, and is designed in a sense to be inclusive rather than exclusive, but it does refer to what we call a body of mentors. So there is a body of senior, practitioners within the Roy Hart universe who are this body of mentors who do have the final say about whether someone is recommended to be a recognized teacher. So there is a kind of organization or institutional organization, but it's pretty loose in the sense that it adapts itself to the individual concerned. It's based on personal transmission, much more than on if you could say, an institutional transmission. So it's very much related to an individual with a teacher, or probably a group of teachers who, if you like, follow that particular individual's development and eventual recognition as being a recognized teacher. I have recently watched classes given by two, they're both my mentees. And I have to say, I thought they were both very brilliant, very, very different. One of them is a very high-level musician, but has also learned how to use their musicianship in a way that is, you could say, from the Roy Hart tradition. Yeah. So there's some of the most fundamentals being a listening ability, a concentration on the sound, and then gradually moving into, if you like, a musical form. So that was very impressive. And then another teacher who doesn't have the same musical abilities, but has a more developed physical, somatic awareness, and has a very acute listening and a very, I could say, on a psychological level, is extremely astute. And this person, met two students that I had been working with for a while, and, immediately went where they needed to go with these two students very effectively in 1 hour. So I thought, well, this isn't bad. It really isn't. They have taken it, and with their own experience, one is she is an anthropologist. She has a lot of experience of working in different milieu, and they have made it their own, I would say that in terms of the future, these people, who are obviously of a younger generation than me, are very, capable of doing it in their own way.
I think that this work, it's a huge part of the legacy of this work, is that it gives me at least the understanding of the significance to work with the people who are in the room with you. Not who was in the room with you the last time, or who you might have thought should be in the room, but it really helps you to connect with the actual humans in a very meaningful way. I guess just, I'm just really appreciative of the opportunity to have worked with Kevin in this way, and with Frank as the editor, in bringing this as, to fruition and as part of that body of work now. I'm glad that Roy Hart's work and that work of the company is part of that project. I think it's important that it's there.
I am also very grateful for the opportunity to have written that book, and I would not have done it without you and without that invitation, if you like, suggestion. So I'm delighted. What to do with what's underneath the iceberg, I'm sure that will whatever should happen will come to be. Also, I think this interview has been a great interview to also, give some of the background to the writing of this book, and some of the important kind of threads that both run through it, but also run through all three of us kind of mindset about that story.
Well, I think we are going to put an end to the interview. So thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, Bernadette, for this interview. Hope to see you in Malerargues. Who knows?
Yes, I would love that. I can't wait to come back.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernadette. Thank you, João.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.